What you're saying is that once we have that data separation, that paycheck becomes your separate property again.
That is correct. Unless you do something stupid like commingle it with community property such that you can't figure out what's community or separate, yes, it's yours.
What is going on, everyone? This is Mark Reel Jr., and you're watching another episode of the Fathers Rights Playbook. And on today's episode, we are going to talk about finances in your divorce. And here to discuss this with me is managing attorney here at Real Fathers Rights, Ryan Dreyer. Ryan, how are we doing today?
Doing great, Mark. How's everyone doing out there?
Yeah, hopefully well. Hopefully they're not going to have to deal with this portion of it. But one of the most common questions we get, one of the really more complex issues we deal with in divorces are the finances. And so today I want to break down a few key concepts when it comes to your finances. So first of all, to get an understanding of this, so for all the viewers, listeners out there, California is what we call a community property state. Ryan, can you describe to the viewers and listeners what that means?
Absolutely. So California is a community property estate. So that means during marriage, from the date you marry your spouse, all income you receive during marriage from your labor is owned by the community.
But Ryan, what if she didn't work and I earned all the money?
That is the funny thing, though, because California views you guys as a marital community or a partnership. Everything you make is technically half hers. Everything that your employer contributes to, say, a 401k or Percocets, any of those other kinds of things, is community property. So, yes, a housewife could stay at home, or a house dad could stay at home for 25 years, and the other spouse contributes to a 401k and acquire stock options and all those other things. That's community property. That spouse owns half of all the income that you receive during marriage. Now, this also goes to assets acquired during marriage. So a lot of we get people that say, "Well, I took that house in my name alone. It's mine, right?" It's not that easy.
Name on the deed, name on the mortgage doesn't matter when you're married.
It really doesn't, right? Because, and I don't want to get into it too much, but all assets acquired during marriage, the presumption is that's community property. If you're going to say it's your separate property, the burden is on you to show why is that your separate property. So without getting into it too much, if one spouse signs over and say they quit claim the interest in real property over to the other spouse, and generally it's because one person has bad credit, right? So one spouse goes on the loan and the loan company requires the other spouse not to be on title, right? Well, there's a presumption of undue influence that attaches there, that basically the spouse who is advantaged over the other has to show that the other spouse understood the full operative legal effect, that they desired that action, that they weren't under coercion or duress or distress, that they weren't made any threats, and they understand the operative legal effect of everything that they're doing. So full knowledge of all the essential facts.
So in short, once you get married, from the date you're married until the date you file for divorce or is determined the date of legal separation, that's presumed to be property, money, assets, debts held jointly. So, and we call that the marital economic community. The marital economic community is from date of marriage until date of separation.
Correct.
And so let's go to another usually contentious area when the date of separation is unclear. So obviously when the filing of divorce, that's kind of the backstop of, that's the latest date of separation.
Correct.
You can't still be together in the eyes of the law if one of you's filed for divorce. So most of the time, though, a date of separation occurs sometimes months, even years prior to the date of filing for this divorce. So what determines the date of separation?
So date of separation, again, you have your yardstick, the filing, right? But a date of separation can happen 10 years earlier. And we have to look at the individual circumstances for each marriage. Everybody's marriages are far different. So you say, well, we haven't had sex in 10 years. That's not it, right? People
be a
have
factor.
different marriages. It can be a factor, and it is a factor.
Yeah.
There's a long list of factors.
So what, moving into separate bedrooms,
Correct.
moving out of the house,
Correct.
sexual relations,
Bank accounts.
separating assets out.
Separating assets is separating finances. So does your income from your employer, does your paycheck go into a community account or a separate account? Are you, it will even get down to giving cards, but the true definition of a separation occurs when one spouse unequivocally communicates to the other that our marriage is done, and then there is another act, an objective act in furtherance of that objective of terminating the marriage. So I'm through with you, you bastard. Or I took, in one case, it was great alliteration where the client picked up a wedding photo that was in a glass frame and threw it on the ground and said, I'm through here, and then she moved out. That was their separation. So there, again, an unequivocal statement that they're through with the marriage and actions in conformity with that statement.
All right, so we got, hey, we're done. This is over. We move into separate bedrooms, and both parties' paychecks start going into separate accounts. Okay, that's a pretty clear separation. Mm-hmm. Another issue we run into is you may separate it for date of separation purposes, but can that date change if something occurs?
It can. It absolutely can if there's like a full reconciliation.
Move back in.
Go
back to the joint accounts.
They go into marriage counseling, and see, that's where there's devils in the details. Was it an attempt at reconciliation or an actual reconciliation? Yeah. So, just going back to marriage counseling perhaps, but not changing any of those other factors, still remaining separate and apart, living different lives. That can have a big effect. And so that's where sometimes you can have really long, difficult trials over what the date of separation is, right? Because it'll be when did you tell the kids? Did you tell the kids? Did you tell friends and family? Did you hold yourself out to the public as a single community, as man and wife?
I'll say this, outside of custody, usually I think date of separation, maybe custody and moveaways, but then date of separation is probably third place. And a lot of times it can be, you'd think like, oh, we're going to be fighting over months. A lot of times you're fighting over years. I've seen differences in date of separation 5-6 years and millions of dollars because businesses were founded, homes were purchased, additions to the home, huge promotions. So the date of separation is very, very important when it comes to the division of that community property. So moving on to, so we have the date of separation, and that's when that marital economic community ends. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the bank that gave you the mortgage, the bank that gave you the loan for the car, the bank that financed any part of your life, your job, they don't really care that you've separated. So we'll use the home as the example. So you and your wife together for 10 years, you purchase this home together, you're the only one that works, you guys separate, and you continue to pay the mortgage. What happens financially in that situation?
Okay, so there's a couple different ideas here, but if you are using your now separate property income, because it is received after marriage, to pay a community property obligation, that mortgage, a right of reimbursement arises.
So let's point here. So what you're saying is that once we have that date of separation, that paycheck becomes your separate property again.
That is correct, unless you do something stupid like commingle it with community properties such that you can't figure out what's community or separate. Yes, it's yours.
Now it's presumed to be separate instead of presumed to be community.
That is exactly correct. And so if you're using your separate property income to pay, let's say, community credit card debts or a home, right, or the property tax, you're going to have a right of reimbursement arising. Now, we also look at who is using that community asset, the home, post-separation. So if the man moves out and wife is staying there, right, and man is still paying the mortgage, he gets what's called an Epstein credit for the payment of the community property obligation post-separation. But we can also have what's called a Watts charge, which is the charge to the community or to the individual for using a community asset post-separation, right? Because if we look at it, that house has a rental value, right? And if wife is staying in that home post-separation, basically she's using up half of a community property asset. So say it's a $3,000 reasonable rental value. Wife would owe $1,500 because they each own half, would own $1,500 per month back to husband as reasonable use or a Watts.
So let's say, so you're paying $2,000 a month towards a mortgage. You're going to be able to get credits for that. And then on her side of the balance sheet, she's then going to get charged fair market value or half of fair market value for the usage of that community asset.
Correct. And so you also have instances where the Epstein credit and the Watts charge cancel each other out. So if you're the individual that is in the home post-separation and you pay the mortgage, most of the times we're saying that your payment of the mortgage cancels out your use charge, right? And so under those circumstances, it's a wash. But yes, and this goes to a right of reimbursement to the payment of any community property obligation with your separate property income or proceeds post-separation.
So, for example, you pay off the $3,000 on the Amex card. After date of separation, you're entitled to a reimbursement for half of that.
Correct. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because remember, it's not just income during marriage that is community property. It's also debts incurred during marriage. And this is the nasty one because I know a lot of you out there think, well, I have my credit cards and she has her credit cards and she can do whatever she wants on them. I've had clients learn a nasty lesson when they've come to find out that the $5,000 purse that their wife purchased during marriage that they didn't know about is actually half their obligation, right? Absent one spouse basically using the money, using a credit card to cheat on their husband, right? To get a hotel room that they didn't benefit in. Anything else, overspending, stupid spending, gambling, almost anything is going to be a community property obligation.
If she went out and bought a $80,000 car, if the Amex has $80,000 on it, even if you didn't know about it.
Right. Was it for a community purpose? So as long as it wasn't a criminal act that didn't further, as long as it wasn't a criminal act, and even a criminal acts can, if they were for the benefit of the community, can be charged back to the client. Now, they're not going to serve time, but the financial repercussions can, right? And so that'll also do as to lawsuits and other things like that, right? So the community property laws are, we're not what they call an equitable distribution state, right? These are laws of convenience. It's just part of the community. You don't get to argue. They can cheat on you and still get half of...
That's probably the biggest one we get. Mm-hmm. Well, she cheated on me. Unfortunately, they don't care in California.
They really don't. And it can
we don't even want to bring that up. It'll just piss the judge off.
That's exactly right. And it's tough for a person to say, wait, she cheated on me and now I have to pay spousal support or I have to do... And that's another topic we can go into. But it really is, guys, black and white. Was it acquired during marriage? The only assets or debts acquired during marriage that aren't community property are separate property assets or debts that are traced to an inheritance during marriage.
That's the big one.
That's
really the only one that's like very black and white. Grandma leaves you $100,000, that's your separate property.
Correct. So long as you don't do something stupid like commingle it with community property. So that's another quick one out there, guys, and we can do another video on this or another podcast on that, is how do we keep our separate property separate. But do not commingle your separate property inheritances with community property. Thou shalt not commingle. Think of community property as a virus. It is going to infect everything else, your separate property, and turn it into community property, unless you have a very good accountant that can trace everything that occurred
Every
during
penny.
that time.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was quite a bit of information on community property, the ending, the date of separation of that marital economic community, and then what happens after. Ryan, thank you so much. To our viewers and listeners, thank you again, and we'll see you guys next week with another episode of the Fathers Rights Playbook.